Have you ever wondered why the Sabbath, a day of rest revered and observed for centuries, holds seemingly little relevance in our fast-paced world today? The Sabbath, a concept as ancient as time itself, is a day dedicated to rest and worship. It traces its roots back to the Old Testament, where it held a place of paramount importance. Considered the seventh day of the week, the Sabbath was a day when no work was done. It was a day of complete rest, a respite from the hustle and bustle of life. The Old Testament paints a picture of the Sabbath as a sacred day, a day set aside by God Himself, a day to cease from all labor and to reflect on the divine. But despite its ancient roots and sacred significance, why do many of us today not observe the Sabbath? This is the timeless enigma we seek to unravel. Stay with us as we delve into the fascinating journey of the Sabbath through time. To understand this, we must first delve into the Old Testament, where the Sabbath was first mandated. The concept of the Sabbath, a day of rest, is introduced to us in the book of Genesis, where God Himself rests on the seventh day after creating the universe. However, the Sabbath was formally instituted as a commandment in Exodus 28:11. Here, God commands His people to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days are designated for work, but the seventh day is a day of rest, dedicated to the Lord. This commandment was not merely about a day off from labor. The Sabbath was a sign, a symbol of the covenant between God and His people. It was a reminder of their special relationship and their unique identity as God's chosen people. It was an opportunity to reflect on God's creation and providence, and to rest in His care. The Sabbath was also about social justice. In Deuteronomy 5:14-15, the commandment to observe the Sabbath includes servants, aliens, and animals, reminding the Israelites of their time in Egypt and their liberation from slavery. The Sabbath, therefore, was a day of rest for all, regardless of social status, a day when all could experience freedom and dignity. In the book of Isaiah, the prophet speaks of the Sabbath as a day of delight, a day to honor God, not doing your own ways or seeking your own pleasure. It was a day to refocus on God, to enjoy His presence, and to celebrate His goodness. In the Old Testament, then, the Sabbath was a day of rest, of remembrance, of reflection, and of rejoicing in God. It was a day that marked the Israelites as God's people and reminded them of His care and deliverance. So if the Sabbath was such a significant commandment, why do we see a shift in its observance in today's world? The answer takes us to the New Testament, where we see Jesus, the Son of God, working on the Sabbath. Now, let's delve into the New Testament, where we find various instances of Jesus performing deeds on the Sabbath. One of the most notable instances can be found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 13. Here Jesus healed a woman who had been crippled for 18 long years. Despite the backlash from the synagogue leader for healing on the Sabbath, Jesus defended His actions, stating that this woman, a daughter of Abraham, ought to be freed from her bondage on the Sabbath day. Similarly, in Mark chapter 3, Jesus healed a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. He challenged the Pharisees, asking, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" The room fell silent. This was a pivotal moment, a clash between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. But perhaps the most compelling of Jesus' teachings on the Sabbath is found in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Here Jesus proclaims, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." This statement was groundbreaking. It shifted the focus from strict observance of the Sabbath as a day of rest to the understanding that the Sabbath was created for the benefit of humanity. It was a day for doing good, for healing, for showing compassion. And so Jesus, through His actions and teachings, redefined the Sabbath. He emphasized that the spirit of the Sabbath law was about love, mercy, and doing good, rather than strict adherence to rules and regulations. This shift in understanding, from strict observance to a focus on mercy and goodness, is key to understanding why many today do not feel obligated to observe the Sabbath in the traditional sense. But what does this mean for us today? Are we disregarding a sacred commandment by not observing the Sabbath? In our bustling 24/7 society, the concept of setting aside an entire day for rest and worship may seem outdated, even impractical. Yet the core principles behind the Sabbath, rest and worship, remain as relevant as ever. In today's context, we might not observe the Sabbath as a strict day of rest as it was in the Old Testament times. The world has changed, and so has our interpretation of the Sabbath. Rather than focusing on the letter of the law, many prefer to focus on the spirit of the law. The Sabbath was intended as a day of rest, a day to recharge and reconnect with God. It was a day set apart, a reminder of the sanctity of time and our relationship with the divine. This principle, the need for rest and spiritual connection, remains pertinent. We all need those moments of pause, of reflection, of connection with something greater than ourselves. The Sabbath was also a day of worship, a day dedicated to God. This doesn't necessarily mean spending the day in a place of worship, although for some it might. Worship, in its broadest sense, is about recognizing and honoring the divine. It could be through prayer, meditation, acts of kindness, spending time in nature, or any activity that brings us closer to God. In essence, the Sabbath is about balance. It's about balancing our physical needs with our spiritual needs, our work with our rest, our doing with our being. It's a reminder not to get so caught up in the hustle and bustle of life that we neglect our spiritual well-being. So, while the traditional Sabbath observance as a day of complete rest might not be common today, its underlying principles continue to resonate. They guide us, inspire us, and remind us of the importance of rest, worship, and balance in our lives. Therefore, while the traditional Sabbath observance might not be common today, its underlying principles continue to guide and inspire many in their walk of faith.